the next guest for the program is the Chief Executive of Deaf Aotearoa New Zealand. Welcome to the program, Rachel. The theme for this year's New Zealand Sign Language Week is "It's in your hands." What do you mean by that?
New Zealand Sign Language is in your hands is a very important theme for us, because language is most literally in our hands, but it's also important because it shows the shared responsibility we have about language. We need our own people to take responsibility for the language prospering, to make sure that deaf people have access to interpreters, that information is available in New Zealand Sign Language, and in order to achieve that, we all have to work together.
I was thinking about the history that we got today of sign language in New Zealand in particular, and it struck me how similar it was to what happened to Te Reo Māori over the last century, that people were not allowed to use that language. What was that like for deaf people in New Zealand, to not be able to use their first language?
I was one of those people growing up when sign language was not allowed to be used, or people thought it was a low status language or not even a language. I remember when I went to high school, and at that time they started recognizing that New Zealand Sign Language was an actual language. And then when it was made an official language, that was the time that deaf people actually felt that they could express a pride in being there and being sign language users. But we're not quite there yet, of course.
I was also struck by the fact that when Van Ash School for the Deaf was set up, the statement was made that ended for a period of time sign language. Why was that?
Well, at the time that they opened Sumner School for the Deaf, which was the old Van Ash School, the principle was that they had more knowledge of spoken language at the time, and they promoted what was called an oral method, so teaching deaf people to sign. So for many years, New Zealand Sign Language was actually banned from education, and it had no presence there at all. And it's amazing to think how the circle has come full turn. Now we can be proud of our language again.
What was happening, if you like, to subvert that prohibition on sign language? How did deaf people resist that?
Well, deaf people still signed in any case. There was a sort of underground of deaf people signing. And while the teacher was watching, of course, they would try their best to speak, but there were deaf people still present in schools, and they would still sign to the children in education. Then an American woman researcher came over. Her name was Marianne Collins Algren. She identified that New Zealand Sign Language actually had the same things that any natural language has. It had a grammar, it had a vocabulary, etc. And this lent official status to the language.
Did that mean that in some ways it required a person from the hearing world to discover and champion sign language before, in fact, it would be acceptable to the hearing world?
Well, at that time it just happened. She happened to come around at the right time, and she had already been involved in sign language research in the States. I don't think it was primarily important that she was a hearing person. It was important that she had this research background. Another situation that had a big impact was the World Deaf Games came here in 1989, and many deaf people from all across the world gathered here. And this had a huge impact on deaf people in New Zealand, because they realized that, deaf people from abroad had all this access, had all these possibilities. And if they could, why couldn't we? There weren't any interpreters here in New Zealand at the time, but there were a lot of people who trained to become communicators, if you like, people who used some basic sign language, and that had a big impact.
Because I know that there has been arguments about the sustainability of sign language as a way of deaf people being able to engage with and, if you like, integrate with the hearing world, and that some of those other methods that have been used, such as lip reading and, dare I say it, cochlear implants, that may be the only way over time to ensure that deaf people can be part of the wider world.
Well, the important thing is to remember that it doesn't matter what you do. Deaf people are still visual people. They access the world in a visual way. So a cochlear implant or lip reading, those are just tools. But New Zealand Sign Language is a visual language which has a direct way of being recognised by deaf people, of being used by deaf people, and it's the language that binds us together. Children with cochlear implants, there's no reason why they can't sign. They can still use New Zealand Sign Language, and it will be there in their hands.
I'm thinking perhaps more of the response from hearing people. I think we understand that even though Maori is now an official language of New Zealand, there's still quite a bit of resistance or lack of interest or just lack of commitment in most Pākehā learning Maori. Some do, but most don't, and in fact a lot of Maori people don't speak or understand Maori as well. How realistic is it that you can expect a lot of hearing people and people in hearing in institutions like schools and so forth actually taking the time out to learn sign?
I think if you look at the language, this is the third year that we celebrate the official recognition of New Zealand Sign Language, and awareness has actually been raised quite a lot. More and more when we meet hearing people, they will ask us actually to learn New Zealand Sign Language, and this week there are actually 200 taster classes happening throughout the country for people who have some interest in learning sign language, and I think that's an important shift. And the more we can make sure that works and New Zealand Sign Language is accessible to people, that means it becomes part of everyday life. Most Pākehā people will know at least a few Māori words, and we want that to be the same with sign language. If they can use a few basic signs, that will make a big impact already. And to have this multicultural, multilingual situation happen in New Zealand is very special.
I mean, you had one school that got an award today because of its commitment to having New Zealand Sign as part of the environment. And that was really for just one deaf kid, which I was impressed by. But I just thought, how realistic is it to expect that that's going to happen in all schools throughout Aotearoa New Zealand? Is that pie in the sky?
When we decided who to give the award to, actually it was a very hard choice because there were so many schools offering a fantastic service and making that commitment to New Zealand Sign Language. So yes, I do think we can have that expectation.
And that can go across to bank tellers, other people who deaf people have to meet up with just to live an everyday life. You think that's possible?
Absolutely, and I'm expecting it to happen.
Who's going to make it happen?
Well, we will have to all work together on that. Really, the deaf community is very strong in its intentions to make it happen. But we do have a shared responsibility. That's why the theme is New Zealand Sign Language is in your hands. That shows this shared responsibility.